So today we are taking up the story of Peter, or at least some of the story of Peter. Last week was Pentecost, and we talked about what Pentecost meant, what it meant to the people at the time, and what it meant to the Jewish people before Christ came, and what it meant to the disciples and to those who were there on that day of Pentecost after Christ had been crucified, risen, and ascended to be with the Father. And we looked in Acts chapter 2. We didn't actually touch on Peter's sermon, but after the events unfold, Peter stands up boldly and preaches a message of Christ's love, of Christ's grace and of Christ's forgiveness, and of our need and of the people's needs to repent. So that was sort of a little bit of a beginning introduction to Peter. And then this week, we're going to look a little bit more at Peter. And over the coming weeks, we'll continue to look at him, and specifically to look at his writings in 1 Peter and 2 Peter. So what is in a name? We have this person called Peter, originally called Simon. But what is in that name? Because his name is important. Do you know the meaning of your name? Do you know what Esperanza means? Do you know what Gladson means? Do you know what Katharina means? Some names have very specific meanings behind them, and our parents give them to us because of those meanings, or sometimes our parents just like a name and they give it to us because it sounds really, really nice. Now, my name, Paul, is a very, very common name, particularly in Western countries. It doesn't seem that special. The Christian meaning for Paul is chosen by God, but the literal meaning of Paul means little or small. Roland, which is my middle name, and don't laugh if you think that's funny, it's a family name, and it's been passed along to multiple generations of males in my family. So I was teased a lot at school because of my middle name, Roland. I guess one claim to fame is it's the same name of a very, very famous keyboard brand. I can see Tim laughing, so Tim thinks my name's funny. And Bottrill doesn't really have much meaning. It's originally a French name, originally is de Bottrill, but it got anglified after my relatives migrated to Cornwall in the southern part of UK many centuries ago. But in many cultures, a name is given like a prophecy. Our parents give us names in the hope that we will live up to that name. Like we might name our child Prosperity. In other cases, a name is given as a descriptor. Blessing is quite a common name. God's love, God's blessing. In the Bible, we see Jacob. Jacob is given his name after he comes out holding on to his brother Esau's foot, and he's given that name because he was trying to supplant his brother or trying to replace his brother by being in front of him. So sometimes a name is descriptive of our parents look at this child and they think, here's a good name for this child. It describes who they are. As many of you know, I spent around about 20 years living in Hong Kong, a little bit more than that. And when I first went to Hong Kong, I was teaching English to sort of help myself, to help support myself as I was learning the language. And I did a lot of English teaching to help in that area. And it was really interesting when I started teaching English. It was mostly to high school students. But I discovered that for many Hong Kong Chinese students, when they're in their primary years, they're asked to choose an English name. And some of them will keep that English name and will continue to ask people to refer to them by that, but many will just forget it. But quite often, the choices of names are very, very interesting, because people will choose names that they just think it sounds nice, or it might be a famous person. So these are just some of the very interesting names that I came across. There was one girl in one of my classes, her name was Red Red. So the color, basically the color red. And I said, why are you Red Red? She said, I just like red. And she didn't want to be called Red, so she's Red Red. I thought, okay, whatever. Some other common names common English names in Hong Kong: Rainbow, Winky, which I think is an interesting one. Kinky, which in some English cultures is a bit of a questionable name. You wouldn't want to be called Kinky. Apple is quite a popular name amongst girls in young girls in Hong Kong. I met a girl called Apple and asked, why are you called Apple? And she said, because I have red cheeks. And she did. She had very, very red cheeks. So her friends called her Apple. Bambi. Cola. Would you like to be named after Coke? But the best name I ever came across was when Kwani and I were in Hong Kong. We were in a jewelry shop and we were searching for an engagement ring. And we were just I was trying to get a bit of an idea of some of the things that she would like. And the person who was serving us, I looked at her name tag just to find out what her name was, because that's usually what I do, just to be polite and to refer to people as by their name. And I realized that her name was Kevin. I thought that was one of the most interesting female names I came across in my time in Hong Kong. Kevin. But today we're looking at Peter, and his name does have significance. Yeah. Peter stood up as a leader on the day of Pentecost, a spokesperson for the disciples and the early followers of Jesus, speaking powerfully of Jesus' life and work and salvation. But who was he and how did he get to this place? So Peter's original name is Simon. Okay, he is Simon, son of John, or Simon, son of Jonah. Now Simon, the Hebrew is Shimon, which literally means to listen or to hear. And in the Greek, it would be Simeon. His father's name, as I said, was John, and his brother's name was Andrew, who was also a disciple of Jesus. Simon bar Jonah, or Simon bar John, Simon, son of John and Jonah. He grew up in a place called Bethsaida, which is a fishing village on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And he operated a fishing business in partner with the Zebedee brothers, okay? James and John, who were also disciples. We know that he was married. We know that Jesus healed his sick mother-in-law. And we know that later on he lived in Capernaum, and we will look at that a little bit later. But outside of these facts, we don't know a lot about Peter before we meet him in Luke chapter 5. Before he sees Jesus talking, and then Jesus gets into his boat because he's being pressed by all of the people, and he speaks from the boat, and then he goes out and tells them to go out fishing. Peter sees in the teaching and listens and hears in the teaching of of Jesus. He hears authority. He hears power. From the teachings that we read of Jesus, we can only assume that he heard compassion, that he heard love, that he heard forgiveness. And then Jesus tells Peter to go out and to fish again. And he says that we've been out fishing all night and we've caught nothing at all. There's no point in going out, but because you say so. So Peter already recognizes some level of authority, something special about this person. So he says, but because Master, you say so, we'll go out. And as we heard from what Susan read to us, they pull in more fish than they can actually handle, and it nearly sinks 2 boats. And this elicits a response from Peter. He doesn't jump up and down and get all excited and say, yay, I'm so wealthy, I've got all of these fish, I've got a great lot of stuff to sell. He doesn't just thank Jesus and say, thank you very much for helping us. We'll be on our way now. No, he recognizes his unworthiness in the presence of this amazing man. At this time, he doesn't know that he is the Son of God. He doesn't know that he is divine, but he senses something special there, and he falls down before Jesus, recognizing his own sin and his own unworthiness, and acknowledges that to Jesus. And then Jesus' response to him is, come with me, follow me, because I'm going to make you catch people now. And Peter what we read is that in simple faith and in boldness, he leaves his nets and follows Christ. This is the first of two key stories that we're going to look at this morning that involve boats. And actually the title for this morning's message is Two Boats, a Stone, an Ear, and a Few Fish. So the second of our two boats is, again, we see Peter and the disciples in a boat out on the out on the lake in Matthew chapter 14. So let me read Matthew 14, starting in verses 22 to 21. Jesus and the disciples have been ministering during the day, and then Jesus sends them off out into the boats. And he says, "You go first, and I will catch up with you later." And Jesus goes up and he spends some time on the hill in prayer to his Father. And then he sees them struggling out in the boat. He sees that there is a storm and that they're struggling. And so then he heads out to meet up with them, walking on the water. And I'll read from verse 22 of chapter 14. I'll read a little bit further down. From verse 24, "But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, and the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus, came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, 'Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid.'" In verse 28, "Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.'" You can imagine the excitement. Wow, look, he's walking on the water. I want to do that. I don't know about you, but I would probably have been quite similar in this instance. "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out into the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when Peter noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" In this episode, we see some of the first signs, well, actually not necessarily the first signs, but we see an example of what is repeated throughout Peter's life. Peter's life is marked by passion, by impulsiveness, like making a decision really, even to follow Jesus when Jesus says, "Come follow me," Peter says, "Yep, okay, I'll go." Peter has this impulsiveness, but then it is often followed with a glaring reminder of his flaws, of his weaknesses. He's passionate. He loves God. He's willing to make decisions quickly. He's willing to follow. He's willing to do just about anything. But then quite often he bumps up against his weaknesses. He bumps up against his lack of faith. In this situation, he bumps up against his lack of faith. One interesting thing I find in this passage, I don't know how you read it. When we read scriptures, when we read anything, we usually add our own tone of voice. When you read verse 31, do you read it like this? Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Or would you maybe read it a little bit more like a father might read it to a child who's growing and learning? Maybe something like this. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" How do you hear that? Was Jesus angry at Peter? Or was Jesus aware of Peter's limitations, aware of his weaknesses, and realized and knew that he was still a growing believer? So Peter shows us his impulsiveness, his willingness to chase after God, but also some of his weaknesses we start to see. The next thing that we see in Peter is we see his name changed. or the next thing that we are going to look at. We're not going to look at the entire Peter story. We're going to skip through a few of the parts. So secondly, I want to look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 19. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah and one of the prophets." And Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah," or the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Again, we see I guess you could say, the spiritual nature of Peter, the in tune nature of Peter, of his ability to hear God or sense God or know God's truth in his heart and in his mind, and then to express that with boldness. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus pronounces his blessing. And then moving on to verse 18, Jesus says, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." So Jesus most likely was speaking Aramaic at the time to Peter. We're reading in English. He is most likely speaking in Aramaic, and in Aramaic the word would have been Cephas. The Greek word is Petros, and that our Bible is written in Greek. Well, yours is written in whatever language that you prefer, but it came to us predominantly in Greek, the New Testament. So Jesus says, "And I tell you, you are Petros," a rock or a stone, a small stone. "And on this rock, large rock, Petra, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against us." So Simon didn't have a bad name. He didn't have some faithless name. It means to listen or to hear. But Jesus says something about Simon here. He says that you are a rock. You are a stone. You are strong. You have a strength. Jesus probably doesn't say what some people think, that God will build his church upon the rock, which is Peter. Because he uses Petros for Peter, he uses Petra for the rock. So he's most likely saying that upon this rock of the revelation that Peter has received is what he is going to build his church. But Peter very much becomes a rock of the early church. As we saw in Acts chapter 2, it is him that stands up and answers the people who are saying, "Why are all these people speaking in the languages that we can understand? Are they drunk with wine?" But Peter stands up and speaks on behalf of the disciples. And he continues to be a leader throughout the New Testament, and a key, what they say, one of the three pillars of the early New Testament church. So here we see the importance of this name. Jesus gives him this name, and it is invested with meaning. And it's important to remember that meaning, because at this point, it's not that Peter has arrived. He's not perfect. He's not a rock that will not be moved. He's still a rock that's a pebble. He's a stone. And that stone can still be moved, as we see in a few instances in this next section. As Jesus' life and ministry begins to draw to a close, we see him preparing for his death. As the pressure and the tension builds in Jesus and in his disciples, we see the earthly, impulsive, not always understanding Peter come to the forefront. In Matthew chapter 16, verses 22 to 23, Peter rebukes Jesus From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter, hearing this, took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Who's ever been guilty of that, setting their mind on human things and not on divine things? Probably all of us. And then in Matthew 26, verses 36 to 41, we see Peter with Jesus at one of his times of greatest need. And Jesus asks him and says, "Can you stay with me and pray? Pray for me, because I'm in this terrible time and I need your support." He said to them in verse 38, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Ask yourself, if you had a friend who came to you and said, "I'm really, really struggling. I'm feeling worse than I've ever felt before. I really need to pray. Would you please stay awake and pray with me?" I believe that you would view that as a fairly reasonable request. But what do we see Peter do? Then Jesus came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "So you could not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." So Peter, again here, a leader of the disciples, is asked by Jesus to support him, and he's probably super willing to do it. But again, he bumps up against his limitations, his humanity, and he falls asleep in one of Jesus' greatest times of need. And again, on the same night, Peter shows his impulsiveness yet again. In John chapter 18, I'm just going to read verses 1 to 3 and verses 10 to 11. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then moving on to verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So Peter again shows his impulsiveness, shows his inability to understand what Jesus has said. So he's rebuked Jesus. He's fallen asleep when Jesus has asked him to pray in his greatest time of need. And then he impulsively reacts and cuts off the ear of one of the people that comes to take him away. But it's not over yet. Peter hasn't reached rock bottom. Matthew 26, verses 69 to 75, I guess we could say is rock bottom in Peter's life story. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." So Jesus is off being questioned at this time. But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. So he has rebuked Jesus for saying what needed to happen. He's fallen asleep during the time of greatest need. He's cut off the ear of a servant. And now, as Christ had prophesied, he's denied him 3 times. When he had that chance to be with him, as Peter had said at another point, we will never leave you nor forsake you. And here he had that chance to see it through. And he failed again. It would be very, very easy for us, sitting here in our comfortable lives or our reasonably comfortable lives, to beat up on Peter for these failures. To say what a loser he is. You know, why did Jesus trust in this guy? Why did Jesus keep just believing in him? He was certainly responsible for his decisions and responsible for his actions. But I want to say, I guess to play devil's advocate, that in Peter's defense, these events took place at a time of great tension and stress and anguish. His best friend, his master, this person that he had lived with for what we understand to be about 3 years, he'd lived with him, slept in the same places, eaten with him, seen him heal people, had built this close relationship with him. And all of this seems to be falling apart. And what comes to the fore in this situation is not Peter's strengths, but what comes to the fore in this time of crisis are his greatest weaknesses. I'm sure many of us can relate to the reality or to the fact that it is in times of great stress and struggle that we often find it hardest to be at our best and our strongest, for our best and strongest characteristics to come through. They're the times that we need them, and they're the times that we want. That's the time when we want our faith to be at its strongest. But often it's not the case, is it? That in the most difficult times, it's our weaknesses that come to the fore. Now, Jesus knew when he first called Peter at the Sea of Galilee, when he first said, Simon, come and follow me, and I will teach you to catch fish, catch people. Jesus already knew all of these things that Peter was going to do. There's nothing hidden from him. He knew it all. And he called him anyway. He still called him. Jesus later on, after this call, calls Peter a rock. As with many other figures in the scriptures, many other faith figures in the scriptures, Peter was a work in progress. He didn't start out as a rock. He wasn't even a rock in the middle. When Jesus called him a rock, he wasn't quite a rock yet. He was a flawed, sinful human being who Jesus believed in and chose him to be a vessel for his love. He was a broken vessel. Now, this we could call a vessel. It's not a jar, okay, and it's not made of clay, it's made of porcelain, so it's not exactly right for this analogy. But we all wish that we were this nice, perfect vessel, beautiful, with no perfections, made well, hopefully, nicely somewhere, an item of quality. The reality is, though, that many of us are like this. That we've got cracks and we've got broken bits because we've fallen over more than once or twice and little bits have come off. And we are very, very aware of our imperfections. We are a broken vessel. 1 Corinthians, God knows this. God is not ignorant of this. And God knew that Peter was like this and that Peter would continue to be like this for quite a while. But God chose him anyway. And why did God choose him? Why did God choose somebody who he knew and could see better than anyone else was like this, rather than like this. And Paul gives us some insight in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 1, 26 to 28, Paul says, "Consider your own call, brothers and sisters, that not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are." And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 to 10, Paul says, "But we have this treasure being, we have this love of God, this gospel, this true, this good news. We have this treasure in jars of clay, so that it may be clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies." So we are jars of clay. Paul says that there's a reason for that. There's a reason that Jesus has chosen to use us imperfect people, and imperfect people like Peter. And that is because in our weakness, God's strength is glorified. God's strength is more obvious. His perfection, his wonder is more clear. Some of you may be aware of a Japanese art called kintsugi. So K-I-N-T-S-U-G-I is the sort of the Anglified way of writing it. But it's an art of repairing broken pottery. So people take broken pottery and they repair it with gold and silver. And this art is based on the fact that it sees that the treating and repair of breakage as part of the history of an object rather than something to disguise. They believe that the history and damage suffered by an object, by a piece of pottery, actually causes it to become more beautiful. Tim, I don't know if you're able to show any of those images of kintsugi that I sent through to you. So these are some of the images. Tim will just sort of scroll through these a little bit for us. Where pottery is taken that's been damaged and discarded, and then they use gold and silver to repair it in the belief that there is beauty in the wounds, that there is beauty in the breakages, and that the article actually becomes more beautiful and more valuable after it has been broken. Thanks for that, Tim. I think that's a beautiful picture for us to keep in mind when we look at our own brokenness, when we look at our own imperfections. See, God knows about our imperfections, and he uses us anyway. He calls us anyway. And he doesn't make us perfect and then say, now go off and serve me. But he serves us, he uses us and loves us in the midst of our brokenness, no matter what we've been through. And he takes us and makes us more beautiful, not necessarily taking away those broken cracks because they're just there, but he beautifies them with his grace and with his mercy. Now, the last part of our message of two boats, a stone, an ear, we come to a few fish. In John chapter 21, verses 1 through 17, but I'm only going to read verses 9 onwards. We see the story that Pastor John looked at several weeks ago, of when Jesus comes to the disciples once again, after he's been resurrected, and the disciples have seen him several times. Peter says to the others, I'm going fishing. So in some ways he's given up. He doesn't know what to do. So he says, I'm just going back to fishing. And they go out and then they see someone coming along the shore. And then it's Jesus, and he calls to them, come in, come in. And so in verse 9, it says, when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with some fish on it and bread. Jesus said, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. A second time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. Jesus said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. So Peter's journey with Christ began in a boat with some fish, and it comes to a conclusion in the same setting. We see a few things going on here. Symbolically, Jesus asks Peter 3 times if he loves him, the same number of times that Peter denied even knowing Jesus before his death. Jesus did not need to know that Peter loved him. He didn't need Peter to say it because Jesus knew that he loved him. But Peter needed to know it. This was part of Peter's restoration, part of Peter's healing. Jesus restores Peter with love, grace, and forgiveness. He doesn't say, why did you deny me those 3 times? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? You said that you were going to stick with me. Why didn't you stick with me? No. He restores Peter with love, grace, and forgiveness. What Peter has gone through has been preparing him for what God has planned for him in his future. Make no mistakes, Peter will make more mistakes, just like you and I will make more mistakes. But the ability to know our weaknesses and failures is essential in being able to receive God's grace and to give it to others. Peter had become blindingly aware of his weaknesses, and God didn't try to cover that up, but it helped Peter to realize how much he needed God. If we are aware of our weaknesses, we are more likely to be forgiving and aware of our need of grace and forgiveness. We are more likely to be willing to give it to others when we are honest with ourselves of our own flaws and how much we need the forgiveness of God. The reality is that we live with the guilt of the decisions we have made every day of our lives. We don't need to be reminded of them. We probably remember our mistakes. We remember our weaknesses far more clearly and regularly than anybody else. Likewise, Peter was probably just like you and me. But Peter's ability to move forward was not dictated by his ability to forget the things he had done. Peter's ability to continue on was based upon the knowledge, the revelation that the rock upon which his faith was built was not himself, not his own skills, not his own perfection, but it was based upon the one, Jesus Christ, who had revealed himself to Peter. Let me just say that one more time. Peter's ability to continue was not based upon the knowledge or the revelation that the rock upon which his faith was built was himself. No, it was built and based upon the knowledge and the revelation that his faith, that his forgiveness, that his righteous standing was built upon Jesus. Psalm 103, verses 8 to 12 say this: "The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. He will not always accuse, nor will he harbor his anger forever. He does not treat us as our sins deserve, or repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions or our sins from us." Isn't that good news? Isn't that the best good news that you could ever hear? That the Lord is gracious, he's compassionate. As high as the heavens are above the earth, and as far as the east is from the west, he has removed our transgressions from us. That in our imperfections, he has taken those imperfections away. He's taken those cracks and he's filled them with gold. And he looks at you and says, "You are beautiful." The man, Peter, that we saw stand and preach with boldness and faith on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 was not a perfect, sinless saint. Absolutely not. He was an imperfect, broken vessel, standing in the long tradition of imperfect, broken vessels, like Moses, the murderer and outlaw, Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, King David, the adulterer, murderer, and liar, and soon to come, Paul, the murdering zealot. Peter should be someone that we can identify with. Someone like you and me who's imperfect, who's made mistakes. But someone likewise who has received the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness of God. So in making the message ours today, I want to leave you with some questions. And I have put them in the chat so that you can have them right there. If I can just get there. And those questions, and these are the questions. Can you identify with Peter? Does his humanity, his imperfections, his limitations, do they encourage you? Does the grace, mercy, and forgiveness of God that was poured out on Peter, does it amaze you that it is also poured out for you? Can you see that in your place of imperfection and weakness, God has still chosen you? He's chosen to love you. He's chosen to use you. He's chosen to be your friend, to be your father, to be your God, to be your comforter, to be your counselor. He has poured out his grace and love in spite of your weaknesses. And lastly, maybe today you need to hear this. I believe we always need to hear this. But maybe today I was thinking of two reasons why we might need to hear this, and you can only answer this for yourself. Maybe you need to hear this message and this truth this morning because you need to forgive yourself and receive the grace of God. Maybe you've been too focused on your weaknesses. You've been too focused on the mistakes that you've made, on the number of times that you've fallen, the number of times that you've stumbled. And you're so focused on that that you cannot see the amazing grace of God. Maybe that's you this morning. And if that's you, then I pray that God's Spirit will reveal to your heart and mind this morning that his grace is sufficient. And that his love for you is unbounding, is unlimited. And it doesn't matter what you've done. There is nothing that his love cannot overcome. And you can still not just have a relationship with God, but you can be used by God. Or maybe this morning you need to hear this message because you need to forgive others and extend that grace, His grace, to them. Maybe you're not aware enough of your own limitations, and you're one of those people who looks at the speck in another person's eye rather than the log in your own. And you need to realize that God has been so gracious to you, and that as a response to that love and a response to that grace, He calls us to extend that grace to others. To be able to see others as God sees them. Like that Japanese pottery repair. Yeah, imperfections, they're there, they're not hidden, but they're beautiful. They're beautiful because God has poured His gold, His silver into the cracks. He is the one that has healed. And that with our brokenness and with our broken parts healed, we're even more beautiful than when we were before. May God speak to us. May He encourage our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.